Funding for Current Conversations is provided by University of Oklahoma President's Office, University of Oklahoma Outreach, and World Literature Today. Welcome to Current Conversations. I'm R.C. Davis-Indiano. Today we're talking about the protest vote for President of the United States in 2016. That is, supporters of Donald Trump, Ted Cruz, and Bernie Sanders. Our guests for today's show are Dr. Mackenzie Israel-Trummel and Dr. Keith Gaddie, both political scientists at the University of Oklahoma and experts on campaigns and elections. Join us for this fascinating conversation. Would you talk to us about this umbrella concept that we're using for today's show, the protest vote, the protest candidate? How does it fit Trump, Cruz, and Sanders, just in a general way?
Well, in brief, a protest candidate is a candidate who's being voted on based upon dissatisfaction. And often they're voted on based upon the notion that there's no real hope of them winning, but you want to send a message to the establishment. And if you look at Trump and you look at Sanders and you look at Cruz, each one of them represents a different protest or dissatisfaction element in American politics. The big surprise is they're doing well.
Ralph Nader comes to mind. That was a protest candidate a long time ago, right?
Yeah.
So what are they protesting? I mean, can we take the Republican Party first and
Sure.
Trump and Cruz? Talk to us. Did the Republican Party do something wrong? What happened there?
Well, so one of the things, if you look at it right now, Republican primary voters are much more dissatisfied with the Republican Party establishment than is actually true on the Democratic side. So in that sense, some of these Trump and Cruz voters are much more of protest voters against their own parties than is really true for Bernie Sanders supporters. In terms of what the Republican Party has done, what they haven't done this cycle is they didn't fight these candidates early enough, and they didn't fight them with a unified strategy. So when it became clear that Trump was starting to sort of attract some momentum, the Republican Party didn't come forward and say, here's the candidate we want to put our force behind. They kind of tried to just let the field decide. And as time went on, it became clear that was not a good strategy for the Republican Party if they didn't want one of these two candidates to be their eventual nominee.
What about recent history, though? I mean, I still keep hearing things that the two major parties just really did not understand the degree of alienation in the culture and during the Great Recession, when those that caused it got richer and many millions of Americans got poorer, didn't have jobs at all, and they're somehow kind of taking that, either taking that out on the party or the parties didn't pick up on that.
I find that very surprising coming from the Republicans, because they've had a 40-year strategy of creating alienation and dissatisfaction in order to attract voters. Mackenzie and I were talking about this the other day. This is the logical endpoint of the Southern strategy. You sow discontent, you appeal to people's biases or their prejudices in an effort to draw them into your party, and the GOP keeps thinking they can control these groups and they draw them in, and then they're shocked when these folks demand to have a place at the table and to have their candidates nominated.
Yeah, and if you think about the Tea Party really coming out in 2010, that was sort of the next step of the Southern strategy, right? It was anger at the Obama administration. It was anger over healthcare. It was anger over this sense that their country was being taken away from them. And that rhetoric was not just coming out of grassroots organizations. It was utilized by candidates. It was utilized by the GOP throughout elections coming off of 2010. And so it's not that surprising that Trump's rhetoric is actually resonating with a significant portion of the Republican primary, because it's not that different from some of the stuff that they've been hearing for years now.
So when Republican strategists turn inward at some point and think about all this, are they going to be faced with the fact that they played to a low common denominator as far as race and class, et cetera, just thinking, well, it would work for the moment and then long term it blows up on them? Is that something like?
I think that is something that people have voiced. I mean, coming out of 2012, the Republican Party commissioned this report where they said we need to appeal to Latino voters, and that never happened. There was never actually a strategy for how can we change the way that we talk about our policies? How can we actually, appeal to this group in a real way, other than just hoping they sort of like something we're doing? And so because they weren't able to come out and have a strategy, it really cleared the way for exactly what's happening.
The other thing I've seen just a little bit in polls, you all know this, really know this stuff, and I remember a little bit of it, is that some voters really hold it against the party that they somehow weren't able to defeat Barack Obama and hold his administration back from having so much influence, and they blame the party for that. Is that a factor too?
Well, the Republicans promised a lot. They promised to do a lot of things in order to win the 2014 election. And they attempted to make a lot of appeals in the 2012 election that are not that different from the appeals that are being made right now. I mean, they've been demonizing the president for 7 years now. And they did the same thing to Bill Clinton beforehand. Remember, Bill Clinton was a Russian sleeper agent or some such thing. There's nothing new in this playbook. But yeah, I think there's a lot of anger out there that they keep promising to do things. And it's just in the area of defeating Barack Obama or beating back Obamacare or reining in a government that they've had as much a hand in growing. The government grew as much under the Bush administration as under any president. It has to do with the fact that they keep promising to do things that they never deliver on to these issue-driven bases. They've made promises on abortion, they've made promises on prayer in schools, they've made promises in terms of cutting taxes, cutting spending, and they've never delivered.
I actually want to ask you about Trump, but before that, real quick, what's your take on the Republican Party as far as its future? I hear Republican strategists say we're in deep trouble. It's a dying party. This really may not go forward. Are they in that much trouble? Is that an exaggeration? What score do you give there?
I don't think it's an exaggeration, because even if they manage to hang the party together coming out of the convention and put forward a united candidate that they stand behind, the reality is they're still fighting demographics. And this election has only deepened that problem. So all of the stuff that these strategists were saying after 2012 about we have to recognize that we can no longer just attract white voters and call that a party. The country is changing. We need to attract other people to the party. We need to do better with women. That strategy has not worked thus far because they haven't really implemented it. And all the rhetoric that's come out of this election cycle from not just Donald Trump, but other candidates as well, is deepening that problem that they already had. So they're talking about the problems with immigrants, with refugees, they're talking about Muslims, they're talking about all of these populations. And at some point, they're going to have to realize that those are votes that they have to contest also. And so even if they can unite at this point, it doesn't look good moving forward.
You can even just say white males are not going to be able to carry the party.
Yeah, they're running out of angry white men to appeal to. Their demographic is aging out, and also discovering that it didn't get what it was promised. And you've got a lot of folks out there that are going to look in very different directions for alternatives. They can look to Trump, but they could also look to the left. That can also happen. And when we talk about Sanders, we can talk about the particular appeal that he could have to that demographic if he could break through and communicate with them. But George Bush advocated against Muslim profiling in 2000 when he ran for president. And they had 3 different times they tried to run an immigration reform in the Bush White House, and they kept getting undone by the war on terror in an effort to pursue it. Republicans have known they've needed to fix it. The fear for the Republican Party is, they've gone from being the party of Lincoln appealing to the better angels of our nature to Donald Trump appealing to the worst demons of our fears, right? But the biggest problem is that the money people who finance the party, they want to be able to do business. They want to be able to control these demographic groups to support what will primarily be a Congress and state legislatures that will be generally pro-business and low tax. And if they can't control these electorates, they're not going to pay for this party. So the Republican Party looks at becoming a defunded party because no one wants to pay for this kind of policy. It's bad for business.
Okay, the big elephant we need to bring in the room, Trump. Strategies are going out the window with the party trying to deal with this guy, right? Who are his supporters? What's a cross-section of Trump supporters and voters?
I mean, it's a bit of a hard question to answer. I think what's increasingly clear is they're not women. Although among Republican women, he's doing better than among sort of women at large. The big problem for the Republican Party is going to be if he becomes the nominee, they're going to do terribly with independent women. They're going to galvanize Democratic women to turn out in huge numbers against him. These are a limited segment of the population. They're white. They're expressing views after rallies about, how protesters should be beaten and that we should go back to the days in which protesters were taken care of, were arrested, were brutalized. That's not like the common rhetoric that we think of today as being what we want expressed in our politics. So I think there's an element of frustration with the idea of political correctness, frustration with the idea of racial and gender advancement, and that we should really go back to what were, considered the good old days, regardless of whether people have sort of an actual understanding of what that means. We see that expressed over and over again.
Is it that message of going back to the good old days is so important that the usual standards that we apply to presidential candidates, knowledge base about economics and political discourse and knowledge about international affairs, having done administrative work in government, et cetera, just don't seem to apply? Is it because that the protest element is so strong?
I think that's probably part of it. I think the other thing we can think about is sort of in more of a long-term horizon, that we've had a decreasing amount of time for candidates to speak. And so with the shrinking soundbite, it's harder and harder for us to actually judge qualified candidates against each other because the media doesn't give them like a lot of time to talk about policy and talk about sort of the nuances. And that's how you get, we've been in this campaign for what feels like 4 years at this point. And yet we know the policy specifics of very few of the candidates' proposals. We know sort of the buzzwords, keep out the Muslims, build a wall. We don't know actually, well, how would you do that? How would you pay for the mass deportations that you're talking about? How would you pay for this wall that all economists say would be impossible for the government to pay for, to upkeep, et cetera? We don't have those specifics because the candidates aren't really pushed on that the way that was true 50 years ago.
Yeah, the media are complicit in this, and by the media specifically, I mean cable news, which is actually where most people don't get their news. Most people are still getting their news off of broadcast networks and increasingly going to internet-based sources, given mainstream but internet-based sources. But cable news went to the bread and circuses. They turned debates into a wrestling match, and one of the things they did by having Donald Trump come into these debates, there are basically two phases to any primary campaign for a candidate. There's what we call, there's a market campaign and then there's war campaign. And market campaign is where you introduce your brand, people get to know you, and you kind of test run your issues and build some name identification and get into the first or the second tier. And last summer, everybody's doing market campaign, right? Well, Donald Trump shows up with excessive name recognition and no coherence in his campaign except that he's going to be anti a few things that resonate with less educated individuals who have generally been left behind by the economy for the last 30 years, okay? And he goes straight into war campaign, and he's going after everybody else, and he's making these emotional appeals, and these debates turn into these rally things that don't pass for discourse, and they're not fair in the allocation of time, and they don't press, and they don't follow up. They made this beast. They really made this beast.
So what would maybe in different circumstances been a true protest candidate in the sense he's wanting to get his issues out there, but at some point will kind of leave the race and go to the sidelines, maybe the way Ralph Nader did, was working, and so he just kept going forward.
I don't know. We'd have to get into his brain and muck around. That's something Gary Trudeau can do because that's his specialty. But we'd have to get into his mind to figure that out. But Donald Trump, if you look at his entire career, he'll try anything until it fails and then find a way to bail out of it. So he was going to keep this campaign going as long as it succeeded.
The other thing, and maybe this is a little off message for us, we've talked about this on other shows, there does seem to be a drift in American culture away from information-based decision-making. You know what I mean? Where people aren't immediately asking for facts and arguments. They go with platitudes and slogans a lot anyway, and he seems to be maybe exploiting that tendency a little bit.
Well, he's exploiting emotion, but also, and this is something Mackenzie and I, that we both teach our students, when people are information seekers, they go to seek information that's going to ratify their prejudices. And I think that you look at, this is why a Trump supporter can so easily dismiss any fact that is going to contradict their candidate or the candidate's position. People will start ascribing to Donald Trump issues that he does not issue positions he does not support simply because they like his style.
It's a style that they're endorsing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he's a strong man.
Let's bring Ted Cruz into this. What can you say about him? Not like Trump at all.
No, I mean, in some ways, he's almost become the anti-Trump protest candidate, which is sort of an interesting place for him to be. He's getting the endorsement of people who've previously said, really awful things about him in public, things about how he should never be president.
Establishment Republicans.
Absolutely, who are now saying, you know what, he's not Donald Trump, so I'll back him. And that's a very odd place for the party to be at, that this is their chance to defeat Trump and not have Trump in the general election, is to have somebody that they've all for years said that they loathe. So in some ways, it's not so much a protest vote that they care about as issues, but now he's become this protest candidate of anyone but Trump.
What a weak position for them to put themselves in.
Yeah.
Where the candidate, they said anybody but him, and oh no, we changed our mind, we'll go with Ted Cruz.
Well, the thing is, this assumes that they wanted to be in this position or they had any choice. Let's go back and look at the field. We had 16 candidates from the start and multiple governors and U.S. senators. So all this political ambition comes out because there's an open seat. And we're in the middle of Gen X presidential candidates for the next 15 years. And these folks are coming of age as presidential candidates, and people with political ambition from that generation are disproportionately Republican. So we see all these folks showing up, and they're all going to take their crack at this. And the thing is, Ted Cruz was so far outside the mainstream, but very well organized. This is the most unpopular man in Washington. Of all the presidents that could be elected, he is less capable of working with Congress than anybody, because the taste that's left in their mouth from dealing with him in the past is so sour.
We think we've seen gridlock in the past. Get him in Washington.
Oh, yeah, this is a guy who probably couldn't work with a Republican Congress.
Yeah, I mean, his own party, they've repeatedly said that they don't like him, that he doesn't work with them. The Senate is an institution full of rules. It's one where people are expected to respect the rules, and he does not. Yeah. And that does not win you friends in the Senate.
Well, so are his supporters, they're not the same angry white young men that aren't very well educated that are supporting Trump, right?
Right.
Who are they?
The core of it is evangelical Christians. And Ted Cruz's father is an evangelical minister. He speaks in the language. He's both a Reagan movement conservative, but also an evangelical Christian. So in many ways, he sounds a lot like George W. Bush, but he sounds like a more hardened and extreme version of George W. Bush. And he's also a guy who George W. Bush doesn't like, who Bush would not give him a job in the White House after the recount in 2000. This is a guy who has a lot of impediments left over from his early political career, and he's gone very far despite them. But, he's getting there because early on he was consistently able to grab that 25 to 30% of the vote in these early states that were mainly evangelical states, and was able to carry it through. But a big chunk of the evangelicals are not going to him. But these are really sort of the more hardcore evangelical vote.
But these are folks that, a little bit like the supporters of Trump, are not happy with current direction of the country, progressive advancement, in various ways with women and minorities, et cetera. So it's a protest vote in that sense. They're kind of looking backwards a little bit.
It is in some ways, but in other ways, his constituency is not as angry about the Republican establishment as Trump's constituency is. And part of this is because they're evangelical, like Keith said, and the Republican Party has had a strong evangelical core to it for quite a while now. So they don't have sort of the same sense that all of their interests aren't being represented, because their evangelical interests are being represented by the Republican Party.
Even then, though, the Republicans have got another problem when it comes to evangelicals, which is generational change.
Yes.
If we look, we've always talked about evangelicals as two types, sort of white, Southern, conservative, rule and structure evangelicals, and then the African-American evangelical churches with a strong social justice tradition, very much like the Catholic Church. Yeah. Now this new generation of young white evangelicals are coming up, and they're getting invested in social gospel, and they're thinking about good works. And you talk to a young evangelical kid, he's going to sound more like a young evangelical black kid or like a young Roman Catholic kid when you talk to him about religion and how you're supposed to act on it.
Let's move to the Democratic Party. It might sound to somebody like we're being kind of hard on the Republican Party, but as far as not reading the situation very well and being kind of clueless, the Democratic Party hasn't really done a whole lot better. What did they do wrong? I mean, Sanders is protesting. He's never been a part of the Democratic Party, and everybody's following him. Did the party do something to lose its support?
I don't think that they've lost their support nearly to the extent that the Republican Party has. So if some of the recent polling that's come out of Clinton supporters and Sanders supporters compared to Trump supporters, for example, or non-Trump Republican supporters, the Democratic Party hangs together much better. So both Sanders and Clinton supporters are much more likely to say, in a general, if my candidate doesn't get through, I'm going to support the other Democratic candidate. So I'm going to stick with the party, even if I really like Sanders and he doesn't win, I'm going to go vote for Clinton. Clinton supporters say the same thing. That is not happening to the same extent on the Republican side. So you have Cruz and Kasich voters who are saying, if my candidate doesn't make it, a majority of them will vote for Trump, but it's about 10 points lower than on the Democratic side. And that is big in an election because you're talking about getting 50+1 across states and then adding up the Electoral College, of course. So the Democratic Party is managing this whole problem better than the Republican side is, for sure, partially because they have fewer candidates to deal with.
What about this line of thinking, and maybe it's just wrong, that says that, say, maybe 20, 30 years ago, the Democratic Party, that was traditionally the party of the working class, abandoned the working class, began focusing on the upper professional class, and working people really just have lost a voice, and millions of people have lost a voice in American politics.
Well, that's what Sanders taps into, and this is actually the big fight, is whether or not the Democratic Leadership Conference wing of the Democratic Party is going to continue to dominate it and control it. Whether or not this Bill Clinton, Al Gore, Terry McAuliffe, Hillary Clinton, Nancy Pelosi wing of the party becomes predominant. Remember, the Democrats have always been relatively cozy with corporate America. They always were getting 40% of all corporate donations that came into congressional elections. They were always getting corporate donations for their presidential candidates.
Despite the rhetoric.
Yeah, going all the way back to 1940. I mean, corporate money would go to the Democrats in large amounts. The working class is left without a voice in many ways, but the working class is different than it was 40 years ago. I mean, labor unions are gone outside the public sector, by and large. And there's a new working class coming up that has very different issues and concerns. And, Bernie Sanders speaks to those, but, he's moved the debate. Hillary Clinton will speak to them also. The Democrats are at least talking about the same things in the same general space.
So what would you say a cross-section of Bernie Sanders voters would look like? Who are they?
They're younger, they're whiter than Clinton's voters, and those are sort of the major demographics within the Democratic Party that are going for Sanders relative to Clinton. So he's doing much better with millennial voters, and he's doing substantially better among white voters, but Hillary Clinton's doing much better among non-white voters, and that's a huge segment of the Democratic Party. And it's part of why she's been winning in some of the larger states and the states that are primary elections rather than caucuses. So there's a story out there that Bernie Sanders he's the one who should be winning right now, but the Democratic Party has been subverting the will of the people. I see that argument come up repeatedly. Yes, she's ahead in delegates, pledged and unpledged. The superdelegates would turn on her if he was actually winning. That's what happened in 2008. They're not going to subvert the will of the people. And then the reason that Bernie Sanders is doing so well is because he's been winning in these really low turnout caucus races, but he's not winning the majority of the Democratic Party by any way you slice it. So she really is ahead, and I think it's clear, as Keith said, Sanders has pushed Clinton to the left on some pretty important issues, has caused her to address them in ways she wasn't addressing them.
The interest of working people, for example.
Absolutely.
The thing is, though, I think in doing that, this is something that I think Hillary Clinton wanted to have done. I think she wanted to be pushed there. I think for anybody that's been a lifelong Democrat, especially somebody that grew up in the 60s and the 70s, you would like to go there. And Sanders actually is giving her a nudge in a direction that she's probably comfortable going to.
Yeah, I mean, and that's not to say that there's not fighting on the Democratic side, because there absolutely is. And I think one of the strongest sort of contentions that's come up recently is coming out of the Sanders campaign saying Clinton's not qualified to be president. And that's
turning around what's most often said about him, actually.
Exactly. And also the fact that, she is viewed as qualified by most Democratic voters, including his supporters. She's not viewed as being as honest as he is, but being qualified is her strength. And I think this is going to be particularly interesting to see how this the strategy of his campaign plays with women, because a lot of women are seeing this as being a gendered attack without talking about gender, because female candidates are often seen as less qualified, despite the reality that women who run in this country tend to be overqualified compared to male
yells and he's
counterparts.
curmudgeonly, and she
Absolutely.
yells and she's shrill
Absolutely.
and too
And so
loud.
this isn't calling, a woman who's running for her first campaign ever unqualified, right? She was a senator, she was Secretary of State, she was First Lady. She's got a long history, and her entire political career has been built on this idea of total competence. And so it's not clear that that attack is either going to limit people's view of her as qualified, or if it might sort of rebound onto the Sanders campaign.
I want to ask a really hard question, and maybe there's no answer for it at this point, but what do you think the legacy of these candidates as protest candidates, what do you suspect it's going to be?
On the Republican side, they're going to have a reform of their nominating process again. The Republicans keep trying to wrestle with their nominating process, and they just can't seem to get it right. The Democrats have a consistent process. The rules are the same in every state, whether you're using caucus or primary. It's the same approach, the same model.
Any willingness here to go out on a limb with a prediction of something that's going to happen between now and the November election that we can look back and say, Mackenzie got that right, or Keith got that right?
What's going to happen is the narrative here stateside, we're going to get into a really nice cooling off period, and a cooling off period advantages the policy-oriented candidate coming out of the conventions. That means that the Republicans have got a big, if the Republicans run on a big ball of anger coming out of the conventions, it's just going to get completely diffused by August.
Oh, very specific prediction.
Yeah. So I think going back to sort of the idea of what's the role of the superdelegates in the Democratic Party, I agree that the Republican Party is likely to reform their process from this election. I think the Democratic Party won't. I think that the anger about the superdelegates will die down, exactly as we saw in 2008. So people were all up in arms about the role of the superdelegates and how they were, backing Clinton despite the fact that Obama was gaining popularity. And I think they're going to do whatever Democratic voters say across the primaries, and people will sort of forget again that this system exists and that they found it anti-democratic about 6 months ago.
We are out of time. Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marcy.
That's what we have time for. I am so glad that you could be with us today. Please join us next time for more current conversation. Thank you for watching.